Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the United Nations doing to help eliminate the scourge of war, to promote economic and social development, and to enhance human rights? Today, we're going to be talking with an expert on the United Nations and on many of these topics. My guest today is Mr. Steve Schlesinger. Steve Schlesinger is a fellow at the Century Foundation in New York City. Mr. Schlesinger also authored Act of Creation, Founding of the United Nations. Steve, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to have our annual update from the United Nations from the international city, well, the international capital of the world, New York City. We do this about once a year. But first, let me just talk a little bit about your book. We'll show this to our viewers, Act of Creation, the Founding of the United Nations. Why did you write this? It came out in 2003, I believe. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. Well, you know, I had worked at the UN for a number of years, and I found very quickly that most of the delegates, many of them anyway, really didn't know where the UN came from. They knew there was this conference in San Francisco in 1945, but they didn't quite know exactly how it all came about. So that intrigued me. But eventually, what really grabbed my attention was the fact that why did the world need an international security body? Well, when you look at the fact that in the 20th century there had been two great wars, the First World War, in which 30 million people died, and the Second World War, in which 60 million people died, then you realize that the people of this earth were so upset and aggravated and frightened about a Third World War, particularly with atomic weapons, that they all came to the decision that it had to be a body that would prevent the outbreak of yet another conflict. And so therefore I went back to the origins of the UN, which are the San Francisco conferences I mentioned in 1945, to find out how it was put together. And the book that ensued is this book, Act of Creation.
And of course, we think back, President Franklin Roosevelt was really, I guess, the brainchild or the architect, shall we say, of the United Nations. And his goal, along with many other international leaders, was to build an institution that would bring the countries of the world together to deal with their problems peacefully and not on the battlefield the way they did in World War I and World War II.
That's exactly right. Franklin Roosevelt actually had been involved with, he had been the Assistant Secretary of Navy under Woodrow Wilson, and Wilson, you may recall, had tried to get the League of Nations enacted, but his own Senate rejected the idea. But FDR picked up on that idea and said, well, if the League of Nations was not going to work, we're going to have to create a new organization which is more realistic about the power realities in the world. And he came up with the idea of the United Nations. And he brought together Joseph Stalin, who was then head of Russia, and Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain. And the three of them agreed on a format for the organization. And then they brought in China and Russia and France, and all five of those nations became really the key sponsors to the meeting in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. And it's amazing that even though it was very contentious at that time, it still is amazing they put it together and got it off the drawing board and actually implemented on June 26, 1945. In those days, they were dealing with World War II. They were dealing with refugees. They were dealing with the rubble, the devastation of World War II. 72 years later, the UN is a totally different organization, is it not? Issues we're talking about today were not even conceived of then, like climate change.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, you would look at the amount of money which goes into various UN agencies as well as the UN itself. 90% of the UN probably is for service kind of programs, you know, whether it's feeding refugees, you know, nation building, things like that. The other 10% or so is on security issues. Now, originally, Roosevelt's idea was this was going to be a security body to prevent the outbreak of conflict. And actually, the UN has pretty much lived up to that goal, because in many instances, the UN has been able to bring about peace in conflict situations. I think of Guatemala, Mozambique, Cambodia, Cyprus. There's probably 20 or 30 different events which might have become much bigger conflagrations had the UN not brought about peace simply by being able to bring in delegates from both sides to hammer out some sort of agreement. So from that point of view, the security thing is probably what gets most attention in the media, because of the fact of the people, you know, are very terrified of war. But the other 90%, as I said, feeding hungry people, helping refugees escape from turmoil, making sure that climate change is occurring, working on climate change. All those things are very much a vital part of what the UN is doing.
And earlier we were talking about Cambodia and some of the missions, peacekeeping missions. Peacekeeping was never even included in the UN Charter, but it didn't take the ink didn't even get dry on the Charter before they were having little conflicts flare up. But peacekeeping with the 16 missions today is a critical part of the United Nations.
Yeah, the peacekeeping part of the United Nations is probably its most signal contribution to world peace, because, as you say, it wasn't particularly mentioned in the original Charter, but because the UN Charter itself is fairly elastic, it's been able to react to crises as they come along. And the UN Security Council came up with the idea of peacekeepers to make sure that, as I mentioned earlier, that a small war wouldn't break up into a bigger war, because they could in place UN soldiers or peacekeepers, as we call them, to prevent that war from spreading. And so from that point, the UN has been absolutely essential in basically dampening the kind of fires that are always springing up around the world. Today, I think the budget for peacekeeping is almost $8 billion. It's one of the biggest items on the UN roster. And I think that one of the most crucial things is to maintain this peacekeeping operations. From the point of the United States, it saves this country from having to send over its own troops and its own civilians to prop up and prevent wars. And that would cost the U.S. budget an incredible amount of money. But by offloading it to the UN, it not only makes sure that the U.S. doesn't have to pay for that, but it also means it spreads the responsibility among 193 nations. And that gives a much more solid foundation to the possibility of gaining peace. So yeah, peacekeeping is absolutely essential.
And there's a study out that shows that by using UN peacekeepers, when you can do it, they can't do it every time, but when they can, it's 8 times more expensive to use U.S. troops than to use UN peacekeepers, which is a tremendous savings. Plus, many foreign policy observers say, well, that's, as you mentioned earlier, you're not putting U.S. troops on the front lines, or no, troops from other countries to a degree, but these are troops who want to be under the UN flag.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, frankly, if you put in U.S. troops, they can be lightning for some, resistance or guerrilla activity. But if you put in neutral troops from India or some of the small countries in Africa, there's much more likelihood that both sides will respect the mission that is in their country. So yeah, I mean, it's very important that the big powers, whether it's Russia, China, the United States, stay out of peacekeeping, except in certain specific situations. I mean, the Chinese do supply some peacekeepers, but by and large, it's the small countries that do so.
Now, the most powerful organ of the UN, there are 6 organs of the UN. The most powerful is the Security Council, with 5 permanent members, the US, the UK, Russia, China, and France, and then 10 rotating members. You've watched this, I've watched it for the last 30, 40 years. They've been talking about the Security Council, how to reorganize it, to make it more effective. Do you think that'll ever happen? What's the magic bullet, I guess is my question.
Ever since the UN came into being, back in 1945, they were fighting over whether 5 countries should have the veto power, the 5 that you mentioned. And in fact, it's never been resolved. For the last 73 years, every new year brings about an effort to try to reform the UN Security Council and either take away the veto from these 5 countries or spread the veto among more countries. And it just never gets resolved, because in the end, the 5 nations that have the veto and got it back in 1945 don't want to give it up. That's number one. And number 2, they really don't want to give it to anybody else. And that unless there's some huge change in public opinion in the world, it seems that it's going to be very difficult in the future to change that structure.
Exactly. Well, as we mentioned earlier, the issues today on the radar at the UN are much different from what they were 72, 73 years ago. Let's talk about a few of those issues. One, we could look at the situation in Iran. In 2015, the UN Security Council, permanent 5 members, plus Germany, plus the EU and some other players, cracked a tremendous deal, if you want to call it a deal, with Iran to actually put a cap on the Iranians developing their nuclear capacity. What is the status of that, and why is it important?
Well, you know, that agreement is still ongoing, and it's solidly supported by every country but the United States, which actually pioneered it under President Obama. It's absolutely essential in a tinderbox like the Middle East that you keep as many countries from developing nuclear weapons as possible. We know Israel has nuclear weapons. They've never admitted to it. But if Iran were to get nuclear weapons, given its intervention in various nations already in the Middle East, they could really provoke a nuclear arms race so that places like Saudi Arabia and Jordan and other countries will try to develop their own nuclear weapons, which would exacerbate the dangers there to an excessive degree. So the point is that you want to make sure that there is some control over this kind of situation. And at this point, the most important thing is to prevent, to make sure that that Iran deal stays in place and is not thwarted by the present administration in Washington, which feels for some odd reason that it weakens us and it takes powers away from us, when in fact it actually confines Iran to not developing nuclear weapons for another 8 or 10 years and reassures the countries in the Middle East that there won't be an outbreak of a nuclear arms race.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps you're with an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you would like to share our programs, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at the United Nations and the myriad of issues it's dealing with, ranging all the way from combating poverty to climate change to assisting 65 million refugees and many other issues. And my guest today is an expert on the UN and these issues. My guest today is Mr. Steve Schlesinger. Mr. Steve Schlesinger is a fellow at the Century Foundation in New York City, and he is also the author of Active Creation, Founding of the United Nations. Steve, before we get off, we'll move from Iran to North Korea. We can't go from one hotspot to another, but this whole debate, there's a movement afoot right now to break this deal. And you hear so many people say, well, the Iranians got $150 billion of U.S. money, which is not true. The Iranians got $54 billion of their own money that had been frozen over the years, and they basically lost $98 billion in the process. But you're right, the agreement has worked. It had one goal, and that was to keep Iran from moving forward with this nuclear program, which many experts thought they would achieve within 6 months to a year. But you're absolutely right. It's been a very effective agreement, and it's one that we need to monitor more closely. Well, we go across to the Pacific, North Korea. We see that that's a very destabilized situation. There's been, the UN has taken some strong Security Council resolutions against North Korea. What is the status of that? And better yet, what's the answer to defusing this problem?
I think North Korea is probably the most dangerous situation we're facing today. The UN has made a number of very important resolutions, sanctions on North Korea, because it will not conform to the global necessity to cut back on nuclear arms, and in North Korea's case, actually eliminate the production of nuclear arms. North Korea is run by an erratic dictator, a young man who is unwilling to be affected by the opinions of the world community. And so he continues to put together these rocket tests, which are getting more and more dangerous in the sense that, from the United States point of view, they have more of an ability to actually hit the continental United States, which was not true in earlier years. And I think that one of the most plausible alternatives to allowing this to go forward is to try to set up the conditions for negotiation, to persuade the dictator of North Korea that it's in his and his country's interest to cut back on that nuclear regime and become part of the world community. If he wants particularly to rebuild his country and wipe out poverty that affects about 50% of the people in that nation. And I think one of my basic disagreements with the present administration in Washington is they're not willing to follow that route. They seem to believe that if you bluster a lot about threatening to terminate the entire government of North Korea, and maybe that means wiping out the population of that small nation, that somehow is going to bring about peace. I think, on the contrary, it actually exacerbates the tensions and means that a single miscalculation on either side can actually lead to a nuclear holocaust. So whereas at that point where we have to be looking for a diplomatic resolution, and so far I don't see that coming, at least from the principal foe of North Korea, the United States.
The observers in that area of the world, and people at the UN and many governments around the world, seem to believe that the North Koreans want, first off, that the outside world not try to change regimes, that Kim Jong-un can stay there. Secondly, that they take their nuclear weapons, that they keep what they have, and we think they have 15 to 20, we're not sure of that. And then the third thing is that they reduce the exercises between the U.S. and South Korean forces, that military exercises. That was a deal that was cracked back during the Clinton administration and actually held for several years, and then in 2000 was scuttled, as I recall, 2001.
It was scuttled by the Bush administration.
Right. And so can't we go back and look at that and say maybe we can pull up some of these ideas and try to get the North Koreans into a negotiating situation?
Yeah, in fact, that idea has been resurrected in recent months, and there has been some credibility given to it because of the example of what the Clinton administration did. And it would make sense, because every time the U.S. has this annual gathering of forces in conjunction with South Korea, where they do all sorts of military maneuvers, it frightens the hell out of North Korea and also puts them on edge, making clear that they, again, if they read something wrongly, they may actually go into war based on those maneuvers. And on the other hand, if South Korea would be willing, and the United States, to basically ratchet down those maneuvers or even eliminate them, in exchange for the North Koreans coming to the table and agreeing to stop testing any more nuclear weapons and confining those that they have to storage, I think there is the possibility of that kind of deal, but it just is not being pushed by, at least by this country. Now, it is true that if it were pushed by this country and the North Koreans did not respond, I mean, that's a different kettle of fish, but we haven't really tried it, so we don't know. And so I think it's worth at least trying for once to see if we can get that kind of deal.
And it's something we've got to move on, because, as you said, we could bumble into it, stumble into a war. And even if they don't use nuclear weapons over there, they're so close to each other, within 75 miles, you could kill literally tens of millions of people within 3 or 4 or 5 days. It would happen. Well, probably the hardest question is climate change. That seems to be the number one issue we're dealing with, the number one threat to the planet. A couple of days ago, we saw where 2 major glaciers in Antarctica slipped off. And if they melt, when they melt, could raise the seas in that area a foot to 1.5 feet, which doesn't sound like much, but it can be very, very threatening to many low-lying areas. The UN in 2015 came up with the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Why was that important, and what can we do to move that forward more quickly?
I thought it was one of the most significant things the UN has ever accomplished. Now, I have to give credit to both the Secretary General at that time, Ban Ki-moon, and to President Obama, who really used his all his force and popularity to make sure that that deal was enacted. I think it's such a shame that the present administration in this country has withdrawn from that. They seem to think that they're being forced into a agreement that is going to punish the U.S. or somehow cripple us as far as our ability to grow as a country. It won't. And on the contrary, you point out the water levels going up. You know, that's going to affect cities like Miami, which are very close to being flooded. It already affected, under Hurricane Sandy, parts of New York City. So we know what the devastation will be caused by the seas going up, and yet we don't have that responsiveness in Washington to that threat. And in the end, what every country has done by signing that agreement is it's a voluntary agreement. We don't have to do anything, even after signing it. It's voluntary. It's not obligatory. And yet the current administration believes that somehow it is threatening our national security. I don't get it. It seems to me it only enhances our national security, protects these cities we have on seaside, both on the Pacific and Atlantic, and makes sure that we're preserving and enhancing our assets and our people and our power as a country.
And you mentioned Miami and Queens. There are days when the ocean actually backs up, not in Queens, but the East River, and also in Miami. You'll have a foot of water in Miami.
Absolutely.
And it can destroy your potable water system, your aquifers. But this is a major problem we need to move on quickly. And it is something that's getting worse. It's not getting any better. We're not slowing it down. Well, we've got so many other issues to talk about. We're about out of time, unfortunately. Let's talk about the UN for a moment. Madeleine Albright, the former U.S. Secretary of State, also the former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, said that the UN was absolutely indispensable. The UN is not a perfect organization. It has its warts and imperfections. But what can the UN do it is very effective in many areas. You've talked about some of those. What can it do to improve itself? As the new Secretary General, the 9th Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is he moving forward with reform measures? What can we do or what can they do to make it a more effective organization?
I think it's been a very effective organization within the limits of its charter. And I think people don't understand that it's been pioneering in so many different areas. I mentioned helping refugees or feeding the hungry, but also helping nations recover and making sure that wars don't break up. But one of the problems with the current administration in Washington is that it's trying to cut back on financing the UN. U.S. is the biggest contributor to the UN. 22% of the budget is paid by the U.S. The second largest contributor is Japan, which is like 9.8%. So you see the enormous role of the U.S. in financing this organization. Unfortunately, Guterres, who's basically a humanitarian, has had to placate the U.S., which means he's had to agree to certain cutbacks in the financing of the organization. They just cut back $500 million from peacekeeping, which I think is a shame, because they were under the pressure of the administration in Washington to somehow save on the budget. So yes, I think it's a terrific organization. It has done great things. I just plead that in the future it be allowed to do that and be financed properly, not only by the United States, but by the rest of the world.
And it's still the only international forum that brings together all 193 countries of the world together to focus on these problems and deal with them peacefully. And as you and I have talked before, many foreign policy experts believe that the UN has really helped to make sure we never had World War III. When you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, we were very close to going to war with some type of nuclear exchange. But the UN is absolutely essential, and it does need to be strengthened. It needs to be encouraged to make reforms whenever possible. But Steve, we were talking about all these issues. I said this was our annual update from the international capital of the world, New York City, because the United Nations is here. We got so many more other issues. We're going to have to make this a once every 2 or 3 months type of update, because there are entirely too many of them that we never got to UNESCO. We never got to the UN Population Fund. We never got to dealing with Syria, the 65 million refugees still moving around the world. But Steve Schlesinger, I want to thank you so very much for a very very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.